Okay. Okay, I'm going to talk briefly about identification of impacts. So going back to before my last presentation, Julie did the introduction on baseline. So once that has been completed, we look at identification of impacts. So impacts are effects, good or bad, on a heritage resource caused by some form of outside action and in the impact assessment system arising from some sort of development. Okay, sorry, there we go. Okay, before the impacts can be identified, as Julie has already gone through, you need to look at what sort of heritage features are being affected and look at impacts upon all of these different, there we go. All of these different heritage resources. I won't go into detail here because Julie has already gone through that. Now, as we also said, the heritage inventory, it's really, really, really important that all of this is understood before we can identify.
So, sorry, Ellen. Ellen has not shown her presentation on the screen yet.
Which is, it's pretty straightforward. It shows you exactly what you need to have.
Ellen, there's no presentation. Yeah. Ellen?
What?
There's no presentation.
Oh, God. Thank you for telling me. What have I done? Oops. Identification of impacts. Oh, share. Maybe I didn't share the screen. No? What can you see? Me?
Just Ellen.
Oh, no. That's no good. I don't know what I'm doing. Is it, can you see it now or just me?
Still Ellen. Just you.
Oh, great. Oh, I do apologize. Share screen.
There we go. Yeah, it's coming. Yes.
It's there now?
PowerPoint.
Okay. I will,
you just have to connect. Yep.
Okay, I'll just run through that again. Whoops, there we go. Identification of impacts. I shan't repeat myself.
Well done. Okay.
Okay, there's all of our different sorts of resources. Okay, I was here, wasn't I? Okay, so the inventory, Julie's gone through all the details of that. I've just put up the guidance on heritage impact assessment. This is a really good, really clear, this is what you need to have on your inventory. All of these things are necessary if you're going to be able to identify impacts. So once the heritage resources have been identified, we look at existing impacts. Now, what I'm talking about here are existing impacts to the existing and to the current environment. Julie was looking at existing impacts as threat and risk. This is something that's a bit different. So it's looking at the existing environment because you have to have an understanding of that to be able to understand how the changes by the proposed development are going to affect your heritage values. So what is the existing environment of the development site and of the heritage sources that will be impacted? For example, are there quarry or mining sites present that would have impacted archaeological sites in the past? Possibly, and destroyed any material there. It's all very a general overview of what your existing environment is, and also looking at the existing infrastructure. For instance, if a road is already in existence and it's being improved, say it's being widened, it's going to have a different impact than building a new road in an area that didn't have one before. So the information for this can be gathered through a combination normally of desk-based studies and site visits, because you have to go out to see what the current situation is on the site. So second, you have to identify all potential impacts associated with the development. I'd just like to say that this is identification of impacts, not assessment or evaluation. That's separate. Julie and I, in our presenting to HIA students and in the past, we've found that people can be a little bit over enthusiastic, and as soon as they see impact, they want to start assessing the impact. But it's really important that you identify, that you look at the impacts that are going to happen before you start assessing them, because it's a procedural thing. You want to do things in the correct order. So this section does not evaluate or assess the impacts. So this is done in the next section. So what types of impacts are we talking about? They can be visual, physical, social, cultural, and economic. So each type of impact needs to be considered for its relevance to heritage impact assessment and if it will affect the OUV for World Heritage properties. The identification of impacts to all heritage sites in the study area must be included. So the study area, as I think everybody will be really clear on, has already been determined in the scoping stage. So at this point, when we're doing the impact assessment, we already know what our study area is. And for example, if our study area contains 20 archaeological sites, we need to look at the impacts to all of those sites. Now, the reason we do that, we're not looking at it in isolation. We want to understand the impacts to the whole, to the context, but we have to look at the individual elements that make up the whole. So we can't leave out some sites or say, well, we think there aren't really any impacts over there, so we're not going to include that site. We have to look at all the sites. And if there are no impacts to some of the sites, then we have to mention that as well. So the identified impacts, they can be presented in tables because sometimes we have many different types of heritage resources that are being affected by a project, or maybe a very large number of heritage sites are present. So tables are often a very good way of presenting our information so it's easy for the reader to understand. So identification of impacts in our HIA, it should include the type of impacts, the timing of the impacts, the duration of the impacts, and also if cumulative impacts are likely to occur, and also if residual impacts are expected. I will be discussing all of these blue highlighted sections coming up. So the types of impacts. This is all pretty straightforward, and Julie has already gone through it, so I won't spend a whole lot of time. Direct impacts cause measurable change through loss, damage, destruction. This can include physical loss or changes to the setting, and it's usually confined to the development footprint. So it's close, it's in close. So when identifying a direct impact, ask, is a key characteristic of an attribute being affected, and what is its relation to OUV? How is this going to affect OUV, or will it affect OUV? So just very obvious examples. Excavation for a site, it's going to destroy any archaeological remains that are present. Removal of part of a building, leaving only the facade of the building. Okay, that's a direct impact. You've lost, both of those cases are physical losses. Indirect impacts, they often occur beyond the project footprint and can also affect heritage resources in the vicinity of the development through interference with living heritage changes in setting and physical loss. So indirect impacts are much larger, something that maybe it's not so easy to immediately identify, but something that we have to look at and be able to identify as part of our heritage impact assessment. So they also will affect how the perception of a heritage resource. So this is, again, not particularly obvious, and certainly to people outside of heritage, it might need a bit more of an explanation. But it's saying how new structures can change the skyline. They can affect prominence. Lighting. So if you have a development that has a lot of lighting at night, it can change the perception of a heritage resource because it's changed the environment. Also, does the development cause a disconnection amongst heritage sites in a cultural landscape, or does it sever a connection between a heritage resource and its setting? These are all things we have to keep in mind when we're looking at indirect impacts. As well, we must always remember that we have to look at intangible heritage. As an example, festivals. They can be affected not only by visual change, but if, for instance, there is construction during a festival, it could also be affected by noise, odor, and dust. So these all have to be kept in mind as well. So the timing, again, we need to look at both direct and indirect for each stage of the development. So again, I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because it's already been gone through, but just to reiterate, we look at the different types of impacts. Now, in this case, I'm sure everyone can see these are all direct impacts during a construction phase. So it's looking at different types of construction that's going to directly impact on the ground. Two of them, the site formation for a bridge and a drainage structure, are within the footprint. Yeah. So the borough area is far away. It is not within the footprint, but we still have to include that. Yeah. So we have to make sure that we're looking at all of the impacts, not just the ones that are directly involved in the immediate project area. So also, again, this is from Began, so fragile structures. We can have sometimes works needed in very close proximity to very fragile structures that could be severely damaged or even destroyed by the works. I've just put on the right-hand side of the slide some examples of plant that's used during road. All of these are used during road improvement projects. As you can see, they're quite large. It is quite possible that any of these could cause irreparable damage to a fragile structure. So when we're identifying impacts, we have to look not only at the heritage, not only at the type, but we have to go into a lot of detail to find out what kind of equipment is going to be used in the area, and if this has the potential to damage, especially a fragile structure. And then during the assessment and the mitigation, we can look at how this can be mitigated. So again, another example, storage of construction materials. This might not, something that might be overlooked in some cases. So there are two aspects that we look to identify impacts here. One is an effect to the visual, obviously, to the visual setting of the little pagoda in the background. That has changed. There's been building material left all over the place. The other aspect that we have to think of here to identify an impact is that there is no safe means to access that heritage site, and that if people would want to visit that heritage site during the construction, they could be injured. You can't really see, but the boards lying on the ground in the right-hand slide had big nails sticking out of them. So certainly these are things that need to be identified. Again, we're looking at things that could be quite far away. We're still in the construction phase. So we have blasting and a fragile structure 2 kilometers distant. If it was a modern building, maybe the blasting would have no impacts at all. But we need to look at the actual fragility, the condition of our heritage resources to see how they can be damaged. And again, this is looking at the study area. For some types of construction, a 2 kilometer wide study area might not be necessary, but obviously in this case it is. So just in the bottom slide, it's just showing, we have to think about airborne as well as groundborne vibration damage that's possible and identify that. So at this point, again, we are not assessing it. We are not saying, this will cause, if this blasting happens, we are trying to assess how much damage is going to happen to this fragile structure. We're just identifying that there's a potential impact, and the damage that's possible will be looked at in the next assessment section. So we also look at the operation stage. Impacts during the operation stage sometimes are not gone into in such detail, but it's really important that if you're doing a heritage impact assessment, that you think and include the operation stage in as much detail as the construction stage. So the first thing that most people think of in operation stage are changes to the settings. That is visual impacts. These are pretty obvious, and they're dealt with well. But we also have to think of things that are less obvious. So construction can also bring direct impacts from ongoing usage. For instance, vibration from a road, from traffic on a road. Again, we have as the receiver, if it's a modern house, there might be no impacts at all. But if that's a fragile historical building, we have to look at that as a potential impact. So visual impacts, as I've just said, they are pretty easy to see. But the reason I put this slide up is just to say that visual impacts can be very close or very far. And I think the slide is self-explanatory, so I won't go to any more detail on that. So an example, again, this is an operational stage now, gravel extraction. So quarrying for gravel, for aggregate, this is something that's done all over the world because aggregate gravel is used in building, in constructing roads. It's something that we find everywhere. So my example on the right is actually from New Zealand, where I work. And often here, the gravel extraction occurs near rivers. So we have a lot of construction and operation going on. And the operation of the gravel extraction could go on for many decades in some cases. So what we have to think of is not only if they're extracting gravel, are they destroying an archaeological site by physically removing the gravel, the area where the archaeological site was located, but also how are they changing the flow of the river? Is the removal of the gravel affecting the flow so that erosion downstream may increase? And could this affect an archaeological site? So we have to keep thinking, thinking outside the box a little bit, like any possible implications that could arise. Now, the slide on the left, this has obviously been excavated by archaeologists. You can see their scales, their ranging poles on this side. But the reason I've included this is because this archaeological site, this old bridge, was identified from a change in water level. Mining, gravel extraction, these developments use a lot of water. They take a lot of water out of the ground. And in some cases, they use so much water that the water table can be changed. So in this case, we had exposing the upper bits of a wooden structure, of a little wooden bridge that had been waterlogged up until the gravel extraction, the water from the gravel extraction reduced the water table and exposed it. And obviously, if it had been waterlogged, the removal of that environment could destroy the find. Now, also, a few more examples. I mentioned planting earlier. As I said, if you put in your scoping report that the project is going to require a lot of landscaping and planting, for instance, a resort, a hotel, or a housing subdivision, anything like that is going to require. So you've highlighted in the scoping report planting. So now you look, when you're identifying impacts, you'll have more detail at this point. They'll show you where they're going to do landscaping, where they're going to do planting. So you can identify if these areas at this point are going to cause impacts. For instance, on a large development such as a resort, a tourism resort, it is quite possible that an archaeological site may be retained in situ within that development. So it would be very important that we don't have planting that is going to affect that site. As you can see at the bottom with the tree, roots go very far. It's not just the little drip line, the canopy of the tree. The roots from trees can spread. And wherever these roots are going, they can damage or destroy archaeology. Finally, commercial tree plantations up on the top right-hand corner. They're very destructive to archaeology. They obviously are ongoing. They plant trees, they remove the trees. The machinery that goes into remove the trees is massive. They have big trucks and obviously the transportation of the logs out of there. So they're very destructive. And they also, as you can see in the background, they often don't replant immediately. So you can have a lot of erosion problems as well. So these are other things that we have to look at during the operational phase that we might not think of immediately. Just a couple more slides because I think we are running out of time. Quickly, the decommissioning stage. So only a very generalized estimation of potential impacts can be prepared if you're doing a HIA and you're looking at all the different stages. You're probably not going to have any information on the decommissioning, apart from possibly how long this project, what is the lifetime of the project. So obviously further study is going to be required in the future to understand the impacts. The important thing about including the decommissioning stage at the HIA stage when you're looking at a development is that so it's flagged up and it is stated in the management plan that this needs to happen. Now, I would like to point out that sometimes an HIA might be required specifically for the decommissioning of a project. For example, mines, quarries, pipelines, factories, dams, any of these developments could have happened before HIA was required, or in often cases before EIA was required. So when you're doing an HIA for decommissioning, it's really important to understand that you may be the first impact assessment. This HIA may be the first impact assessment that has happened for this project. So some of the potential impacts from the decommissioning stage are decontamination, demolition, and reinstatement. And I just added this little picture at the bottom because this was actually put together for a public interest group that found out that it's a site of special scientific interest. It's a natural heritage site, and that the government had decided that an EIA wasn't required. So and it was for a decommissioning project. So they actually put together a public group to make sure that an EIA was done. And the reason I put it up is because it is specifically for decommissioning, not for a development, but for the end of a development. Just briefly, like when I say decontamination, we could have a pipeline or even a storage. And when they were installed, obviously there would have been some impacts. There would have been the pipelines underground. They would have had to dig a hole and install the pipeline. But you have to remember that especially if there's contamination, the works to remove the pipeline might contain the necessity for excavation to be spread over a much larger area than was for the original installation. So we could have direct impacts if there is any archaeology. Again, that pipeline and that tank, they might have been put in before with no heritage impact assessment at all. So it's quite possible that there could be archaeology in the area. Demolition, just a couple of examples. Mechanical destruction on the right-hand side. And this causes similar impacts to construction. Obviously, there's going to be vibration, danger from material going outside of the boundaries where it's supposed to. Also for demolition, there's obvious where does all the waste material go. On the left-hand side, controlled demolition. So implosion. Now, when they do these, if they're done properly, they are in a contained area. There is no physical damage, but they do, one thing we could look at is they could cause a lot of dust and particle exposure to nearby buildings. And if we do have a building that is susceptible to damage from activities like this, it will need to be identified. So rehabilitation, I just put this one in here because I think this is a really nice example. It's a railway. So it was an historical railway. This is on the South Island of New Zealand in beautiful country. And the railway was in operation until the 1990s. So it was a modern railway, obviously with some historical elements. And it was decommissioned in the late 1990s. And what we have to do, and I think this is a really good example, in rehabilitation, we're not looking at protecting or reducing negative impacts. We're looking at enhancing. We're looking for beneficial impacts. And I think this is a good example, because what happened was all of the railway infrastructure was removed and a cycle trail was put in, and it's worked very well. It's very popular, and it's rehabilitated the heritage aspects of the trail without and benefiting them, but also producing a new tourism attraction to the area. So finally, well, not quite finally, sorry, the duration of impacts. We need to look at temporary, permanent. So you'll often see temporary, permanent with different definitions. So, you know, I've just stuck an example again in here from New Zealand. So temporary, how the road projects, the National Road Government Agency, they say a temporary is a short term, and they use it in, once the construction phase is over, that's when you have temporary impacts. They consider there's medium term, which is defined as 15 years, and long term is more than 15 years. There's no definitive definition on what is temporary and permanent, so you just have to, look at duration and think, if it's, to be honest, if it's 15 years, it's, you know, is there a big difference between medium term and long term in this case? Well, for heritage, possibly not. Okay, so however they are defined, when identifying impacts, you do need to indicate how long they are expected to last, as this will affect the level of impact in the assessment section of the HIA. Another thing to keep in mind is the impact irreversible or reversible. And these irreversible and reversible impacts can happen at any stage. So just an example for the construction stage. So this is a temporary impact for the New Zealand road projects, but if there's excavation that destroys an archaeological site, then this is actually a permanent impact, and it is also irreversible. Oops. Okay, really quickly, I'm just going to run through cumulative impacts, because we really need an entire slide presentation on cumulative impacts. So cumulative impacts result from many different, and often when they're looked at individually, insignificant effects from both existing and planned developments. So the damage from cumulative impacts is often caused incrementally, and it occurs over time. Example could be depletion of groundwater from numerous developments in a small area, fragmentation and loss of cultural landscapes, and lack of coordination on location choice. So how do we identify cumulative impacts? So you need to not only look at the impacts from your own project, but also at other proposed developments and existing developments, and also projects that are likely to occur in the future. So will the effects of your project in combination with other projects create significant impacts to the OUV that need to be assessed as a group rather than individually? So cumulative impacts, they're quite different. They are in their own category, and they should be presented in a separate section, sometimes also in a separate report. So cumulative impacts need to be identified really early on to ensure sustainable development. This is normally done through strategic environmental assessment, which incorporates environmental considerations into government policy plans and programs. So it's recommended for areas where projects such as large dams, regional road networks, large-scale agricultural projects are planned in the future. So this is planned in the future. So the strategic environmental assessment happens long before. It's not project specific. It's looking at a general area and how many projects are going to impact on it. Really, really quickly, just an example from Germany for wind farms. So there were many proposed wind farms in the buffer zone of this World Heritage Site, Upper Middle Rhine Valley in Germany. And the different proponents for the wind farms presented separate impact assessments to the World Heritage Committee. And these were not able to be assessed because individually it is not possible to understand what the effects of all of these wind farms are going to be if you look at each project individually and not as a group. So the recommendation was that proposals, so not the plan for this, but all wind farms need to be assessed through strategic environmental assessment, and this needs to happen before the planned wind farm, before the location, before everything. So, you know, if wind farms are going to be allowed to be constructed, it has to be in a sustainable manner. So this highlights the importance of identifying cumulative effects at the earliest possible stage, so that adverse outcomes can be avoided through appropriate policy and planning decisions, including incorporation of spatial framework. So this will ensure that projects do not endanger the status of the World Heritage Property, as long as they're done in advance. Residual impacts, really quickly. These are the impacts that remain after mitigation. So these need to be identified as well. So as we said, these are impacts that are not, they can be reduced, but they cannot be completely removed. So these can only be identified after the impacts have been assessed and mitigation measures recommended. So that these will go into a separate section in the HIA report. And it will also state if any have been identified and how they will be dealt with. So that as a residual impact, this should be a minor impact, because after the assessment, after mitigation, the findings of the HIA report are that the project can go ahead, even though these impacts will remain. But it's very important to remember, if the residual impacts have the potential to impact the OUV of a World Heritage Site, they will require monitoring to ensure they are maintained at acceptable levels throughout the operation of the project. So that means as long as that project is in operation, as long as those impacts remain, monitoring is necessary to make sure that the residual effects are kept to acceptable levels. Just a quick example, changes in water flow during the operation of a dam may cause riverbank erosion. Periodic monitoring should be undertaken in this sense to make sure that erosion is within acceptable levels. And I will talk about that in a bit more detail when I do the section on monitoring. And that is all from me for this section.